Welcome back to the .NET on Azure Beginner Series. So far we've set up our development environments. We have taken a web app, put it into Azure and have it talking to Azure SQL Server. And then we introduced blob storage where we were able to not only see a blob, an image of our months and pickles and reviews, but also upload a review that had an image attached to it, and then wrap a CDN around it so it's available on the Azure Edge. Now, we were doing reviews, but anybody could do a review, and it was all attached to Matt. So what we want to do now is have authentication and authorization so anybody can do a review, but it's attached to them. So let's implement that, and we're going to implement that with a service called Azure AD B2C, or business to consumer. And what that lets you do is that it lets you log in through things like email and password, or GitHub credentials, or like Facebook credentials, or what have you. And then it gives you a token, and that token then allows you to access a web API and a backend. So there's a whole lot of identity stuff involved with it. And we're not going to get involved with the whole identity portion of it, other than setting up our app to access it. We can have a whole other series on using .NET for identity, and maybe we should, maybe we will. But for now, we're just going to get our app using the identity portion for it so we can set ourselves up for later. All right, so first off, what we need to do is provision an Azure AD B2C tenant within our subscription. So what we can do then is look for, as we are doing everywhere, do Azure AD B2C. Once we find that, we're going to want to go ahead and create one. So I'll hit create a resource, then I will search for B2C, and then I can see Azure Active Directory B2C shows up, and then I will create that. And so it gives me two options here, whether to create a new one or link an existing B2C tenant to my Azure subscription. So this is because when we created Azure B2C tenant, it's like entirely different than our regular Azure subscription. So when we log into an Azure tenant, that's ours. That's where our company's subscription and all our resources go. But a B2C tenant, that's where our consumers are going to log in. So we want to keep those separate. So we're going to create a brand new tenant. Once that spins up, we want to give it an organization name. So we're doing everything called Months and Pickles. An initial domain name. And so we'll call that, again, Months and Pickles, and see if that's been taken or not. And it spins up, and that's available. And then we're going to keep that in the US. And then it's going to ask us again for subscription and resource group. And so our resource group, we're going to do RG, Munson East US Dev 001. So before we were keeping track of RG Munson East US as in resource type and then application name, area. But initial domain name here, I just said Munson Pickles. That's because it's going to be used elsewhere and I want it to be more human readable than having the B2C-Munson-whatever. So again, keeping consistent to whatever framework that we decided to have. All right, review and create validation passed, and then I'm going to hit create here. And so the tenant creation is going to take quite a while. So once that provisions, we can go out and then view it. And it's going to open up in an entirely new tenant for us. And so what's neat here then is that we can go through and then start creating ways for our users to log in to our app. And that's known as user flows. So I'm going to create a brand new user flow, and I'm going to call it sign up and sign in. So there's different types of user flows as well. There's profile editing. So once you have a user account, we can go through and edit things like our name or display name or maybe our birth date, password reset, or just a regular sign up or a regular sign in. Profiles, user flows, sign up and sign in is like all in one. And then you can have something called an ROPC, or Resource Owner Password Credentials user flow, which is something that you would use on a mobile app more than anything else. So let's create a sign up and sign in one. Take that, and the version recommended Once that's created, we'll give it a B2C_1 name. So this is only going to be referred to on the site. And so normally what it's going to be called is B2C_1_sign_up_in, so we know what it is. And then this next one is asking us for the identity providers. And so right now, all I have hooked up here is email signup. If I would go through and hook up things like Facebook or GitHub for my identity providers, they would also show up here too as well. So going through and hooking those up would require me going out to GitHub and creating a special key, bringing that key back over to B2C, registering that, and so on. It's a process, and that is covered in the documentation, but for now we'll just do email signup. And then it's asking me for multi-factor authentication. So I'll just do email. I don't need to enforce it. And so I'm just setting up a development environment here. And then finally, down here, it's asking me what attributes I want to collect for when my user signs up. So both what attributes I want to collect and what I want to return. So I'm going to say, all right, I want to collect my display name, email address, and how about both a given name, and I'll return that too. So it's just a return claim is sending back information saying, you know what, I'm claiming who I am, the claims, and then attributes who I'm collecting from. Hit OK, and then I can create it. So it's going through and creating my user flow right here. And that shouldn't take too long to go ahead and do, and it's already successful. So the next thing I want to do is actually go ahead and create a app registration for this. And so what an app registration is I'm taking my Munson Pickles app and I'm letting B2C know about it, that it's going to have callback information. So you hit login. The login is going to shell out to B2C. It's going to actually display an Azure AD B2C login page. So we do the login all through Azure AD B2C. Our app doesn't actually have any username or password in it. It doesn't control that. B2C controls that. And then B2C then returns the information to our app. And this app registration page is where we take care and set all that up. So I'm going to do a new registration, and I'll call it Munson Web for our web app. And then we'll say accounts with any identity provider or organization directory. So this is usually the B2C one here, the bottom one. And defaults that B2C puts in is usually the correct one. And so I'm going to leave the redirect URL blank for now. We'll set that up in just a second. And then hit register as it goes through. Great, we have a successful Munson Web application. Great, and so what I want to do then is eventually add a redirect URL, and that redirect URL is letting B2C know what to call once somebody signs in or signs up for our web application. So let's go ahead and look at our apps. So from before, if you were watching a series, we had everything in one single application, the Munson Pickles.web app. I have now split that out into two. I've created also a Munson Pickles.api application. And that API application controls the database access. It now has the pickle.db context in it, and it has a bunch of gets and sets. It's a Swagger API. Has Swagger tooling put in front of it, and so it has like the map get products, which just returns all the products from the database, and so on, where you can get a product ID as well. You can get reviews for a product, and so on. There's nothing really crazy that's going on in here. It's just that I have it separated out. And this way, in the future, I can then restrict down for when I post a review. I can make sure that only people who are authenticated, I can start authorizing them to only they can post the reviews. Whereas anybody can view a review or anybody can view the products, but you have to be logged in order to actually post the review. All right, and then over on the Munson Pickles.web, everything's the same as before, except we are calling out to the product web API to get the information instead of just having the DB context in. So API gets the database, web calls to the API to do its thing. All right. So the other things I just want to make sure we have going is I'm letting the Munson Pickles web know where our CDN endpoint is, which I want to update to be our latest and greatest. CDNE Munson, and then make sure that we're going everywhere at the right point. CDNE Munson-dev-001. That way it's pulling the images from the right spot. And here I want to also make sure that it pulls the review endpoint and the product endpoint URLs from the right spot as well. And I can find out where that's going via the launch settings. And so it's launching to 7169 of the HTTPS. And I drop back here. And I am pulling from 7169. So great. So then when my product service lights up and I configure everything and I start adding the HTTP client to it, what I'm doing is I'm pulling it out of the app settings and saying, you know what, HTTP client, use that whatever you found in the app settings as your base address. So that way I just have it in there. All right, very good. So now what I want to do is actually start adding authentication to the web app. And so the first thing we need to do is give it a callback URL on the B2C side. And so that callback URL is going to be the launch settings of where to call it at. And it's going to be this address of 7075 of localhost. So let's do that. I'm going to go back into the app registrations. I have Munson Web already loaded up, and then add a new redirect URL. And I want to add a platform, and it's going to be a web app. And so here's the redirect URL. So it's going to be localhost 7075, and then because I'm using the Microsoft.identity.web SDKs, which we'll talk about in just a second, it has set up already a specific callback path for me of signin.oidc. So when everything is logged in and done, B2C is going to call back to this address to let my website know, you know what, I'm good to go. And for the front channel logout URL, pretty much the same thing except signout.oidc. And I also want to make sure I grant it implicit grant and hybrid flows. Again, we're getting kind of deep into what these things are, and I'm just setting them up to begin with. We'll have additional information about how to do identity and what it all means and really how to get into it. But right now, we're just getting it going. So I'll hit create, get everything up, and I can see now I have a localhost 7075 signin-oidc, and I'm also going to add this in, jwt.ms. And so what jwt.ms does, it allows me to actually view tokens that B2C returns in my browser. So I can just see things and kind of debug them as well. So I can have it return to more than the one spot at a time. All right. Applications created for my web app. I want to actually create an account now. So I can go down to my user flows and actually test it out. So I see my B2C_1_ sign up, sign in. And I could run it right from the browser just to kind of test it out. And I could see, all right, I'm running Munson.web, and it asked me to pick which URL I want to reply to. Well, I want to reply to jwt.ms. And then I could set which access token and like scopes if we set any of those up, which we'll talk about in a second. And then I can run the user flow. And so now I'm going through and actually saying, you know what, let's actually sign up for something. So go through, enter some credentials. And actually, I can't sign in. I want to actually sign up. So I'll hit the bottom here and say sign up. And you notice I didn't create these pages. These were actually done all for me from Azure AD B2C. So first thing, I'm going to create an account telling it what my email address is. It's going to send me a verification code. And I'm going to check my email to make sure I can get at it. And it's going to be 954817. Verify the code. All right, it knows that I own that email address, and then I can start entering a new password. And the passwords, we can control like how complex you want them to be if you wanted them. And I'm just using the basics of having one capital letter, one numeric, and one punctuation point. So, and also remember before when we set up the attributes that we wanted to collect, the display name and then the given name, it's asking me to enter those as well. So I'll go through, I'll hit create. It's going in, creating my account, and now I'm having it point back to this jwt.ms application, which returns my token. And this token shows me everything that it has within it, and the claims that I got returned as well. And these claims, if you remember, are what gets returned. I'm claiming who I am, and it has name, Matthew, given name, Matt, and also the policy that was executed for me to run in here. So B2C_1_sign-up-in. So all this is actually what gets returned to the application when it runs it. Our B2C tenant for the web application is now set up. Let's connect that to our web app. All right, I'll open it up. So first thing first, what I did is I have installed a couple NuGet packages to help me out. And they are, the most important one is Microsoft.identity.web and Microsoft.identity.web.ui. These are going to essentially inject themselves into the controllers, the middleware pipeline, to show me and give me some help when I'm logging in. And then there's all the ASP.NET ones. Authentication.jwt, bearer, Java Web Token, OpenID Connect. So these also help me authenticate. All right, so I installed those NuGet packages, and then the next thing I want to do is set up my Azure AD B2C parameters. So all this is doing right here, instance, client ID, callback path. I'm now mapping what I created before into my app settings. And there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of things that are just copying back and forth. So the instance is going to be right here, the munsonpickles.b2clogin.com. All right, so let's go back here. HTTPS munsonpickles.b2clogin.com. The client ID is what we registered before when we created the app registration. Open that up, and you can see that it gives me an application/client ID. I'll copy that in, paste that in. The callback path, remember that when we created the web application authentication URL, we specified that we wanted to call back to signin-OIDC. Well, that's what we're telling the Microsoft.identity.web. Expect it to come back in at signin.OIDC. The domain is what we actually, overall, what we created, Munson Pickles, the B2C tenant to reside on, and that's munsonpickles.onmicrosoft.com. And then finally, our sign in, sign up policy ID, that's our user flow. And that's called B2C1 sign up in. All right. We can leave everything else blank and as is, and we should be able now to run the application and sign in. So what we needed to do is right here is that we're telling the web API, the Microsoft.identity.web, you know what, we're using OpenID Connect, and then add your UI to it, looking at that Azure AD B2C section that we just added to grab the parameters out of. Once we have those parameters out of it, add those controllers in, the Microsoft.identity UI, and then we're saying, you know what, authorization, use the default fallback policy. Then at the very, here we're saying, you know what, server-side Blazor, we're using the Microsoft Identity Consent Handler. So this is all stuff I should mention that comes with the file new template. We need to specify authentication. And then at the very end, we're saying use authentication and authorization as well. All right. Now, assuming that I went and copied all these values in correctly, we should be good to go. So I'll hit run, and then everything will spin up. And then with Blazor Server, because it's SignalR, it will want me to log in right away because SignalR wants authentication immediately. And I might have to go to a in-private window because it's cookie-based and I've been logging in quite often. So let's see how things work. All right, so you can see that it automatically went to munsonpickles.b2clogin.com, and the target, here's the target machine is actively refused my request. Well, that's the web API. I didn't start that up. So let's start up the web API. And once that gets going, I should be able to hit refresh. And that's spinning up yet. All right, I got my Swagger endpoints up. I should be able to hit refresh here. And now you can see I am actually signed in. It says, hello, Matthew Sokup. So I signed in through Azure AD B2C. It sent a cookie. It set a cookie, and now it remembers me here. So what I'm going to do is copy my URL, open this up in private mode, pass that in, and now it's going to prompt me to sign in. So I'm going to enter that. Same credentials as I did before. And hit sign in. And everything works again. And all I did as far as setting up the identity SDKs was just from the file new template. Didn't do anything special yet. The hardest part, quite honestly, was going out to Azure B2C, the tenant, setting all that up, and then making sure I copied everything correctly back over to the app settings JSON file. All right, we're set up. So let's go ahead and make sure our web API then is set up. And again, we're going to go back to the Azure B2C tenant and then add a new app registration. And we'll call this Munson API. We will give it a public native web API redirection. And that's going to be what we get from the launch settings, 7169. And we actually don't need to go really in depth in this because we're not actually going to be calling this, logging in from here. Rather, this is going to be our receiver of things. And what do I mean by having it as the receiver? Well, I'm going to actually expose an API or expose a scope, something that says, whoever's calling me, you better have this scope, otherwise I'm not going to let you in. And so the scope, we're just going to say access as user. That's our scope name. And a full scope name is displayed below it. And just give it some metadata, access as user, access this API as a user. Again, that's just metadata. Add the scope to it, and now it's here. So this API itself is now saying in order to access this overall app registration, this overall application that's in B2C, somebody's going to have to present me this scope. All right. And so how do you do that? Well, back into Munson Web. I go to API permissions, add a permission. API is my organization's uses, and now I can see Munson API is in there. And Munson API now has the access as user. I'll add that permission in, and then grant admin consent for everything. There's a lot of back and forth here, that's for sure, and now we're good. So now when I log in to Munson Web, I'm going to get back this scope, and it's going to say, all right, I can now then hand this over to the Munson Web, Munson API, and it's going to let me in. All right. So let's show that up here when I can actually go through and sign in one more time through the user flows, and I'm going to show the JWT MS come through. Run the user flow, pass it to JWT MS, give it my password, sign in. Assuming I typed it all correctly, it'll pop me back to jwt.ms, and I'm all good. And one thing I did forget to do is I should have requested my access tokens and claims. So now, there was nothing in here for an access token. But I go back over here to access tokens and claims, and I say, you know what? I want the Munson API, and I want, access as user. Now run it. Again, having to sign in. And when jwt.ms shows up again, the token that it gives me will now have scopes in it, and it will allow me to sign in. Okay, so what I want to do now is then add everything to my Azure AD Web API, then have the web app called B2C, B2C return the scopes so I can hand those over to the API. So let's see how that all looks. And I already have a version already created, so I don't have to retype it all and possibly mix something up. So I'm going to open up the Pickle Web. And so one thing that's going to be noted about the Pickle Web is in my app settings, there's also going to be a client secret. And the client secret you get from the B2C tenant in the app registrations as well. And it's essentially a secret that the web app can pass along to the web API to let it know, you know what, I super secret know that I am who I say I am. And that's done in the certificates and secrets section of it. So once we put that in there, then we have the secret, which we can then add to here. So this is actually pointing to a different B2C setup that I have before that I know is up and running. So you can see I have the instance, the client ID, the callback path, and so on. And this is the web app running. So nothing actually changes here except I add a scope to it that says, you know what, I'm going to use the fully qualified review API scope, call it access as user. And then in my program.cs, I'm pulling that scope out of the configuration file, and then I'm doing this line. Enable token acquisition to call downstream API. Essentially, when we ran the run user flow, and we had to check those extra checkboxes to say, you know what, I want to actually get my tokens and for these scopes, that's what this is saying. So it brings that back, those extra tokens, and puts them in here. All right, web is set up. So let's take a peek at the web API then. Open up the finished solution for that one. And its app settings is going to look kind of a lot like it does over on the website, where we have the instance, we have the client ID, but this client ID is only for the web API. It doesn't have anything to do with the web app, the domain, and then the scope that we want to check for. All right. And then in the program.cs, we're going to just say, tack on, require authorization for when we create a review. Okay. So again, assuming that we set everything up, I'm going to start up the web API and let that chug through. And I'm going to use the Swagger tooling first to call out to the DB and make sure that we are up and good. So this one doesn't have any authorization to it, and I am getting back my dill pickle information. But when I then open up my reviews and I try to put something out, test product 1, and I'm going to pass in a URL, https coolurl.com, and then execute that, I'm getting back a 401 or a not authorized. All right, that's because we're requiring the authorization and we're not actually passing any token over to it. So leave that up and running and then start up the web app. So this web app is now has everything pointed to as before, except we are now asking for the additional scope so we can call a downstream API. All right, I'm already logged in. I will go through and then create a new review. New review with scope. And I'm just going to save it. And you can see over here, I'm already into my reviews, hit a breakpoint, and then I can step into it, and I'm writing away. Cool. There's a lot there, and most of it is setting up the B2C itself. We have to set up the B2C tenant. Then we have to go set up the user flow, which says how we actually get to log in to our tenant. And that's going to be both whether it's email or whether we want to do a social provider such as GitHub or Facebook or what have you. And then we have to create app registrations that live within our B2C tenant that model our real application. And so what we do then is for the app that we interact with, our web app, we create that and we give it a URL for B2C to return information to. Then we create a web API one and we have it expose an API. That API essentially is saying, you know what, I want to have a specific permission that you have to call me with. Set that up, go back to the app registration for the web within B2C and say, yes, I want to also send that along when we log in. Enter all that back into the app settings on our client code. Then we use the Microsoft.identity.web to do all of that. All that work, though, really is done for us after we do all the setup just by saying, you know what, enable acquisition to call downstream API, store everything in the token caches, and it does silent refreshes if we need to. It'll reprompt us to log in if we need to. And then over on the API side, we can say require authorization. Now, if we wanted to do require authorization for specific scripts, we could do that as well. Or for scopes, we can say, you know what, we want a specific scope to log in. We can specify that as well for this particular endpoint. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with the built-in Microsoft.identity.web. All the hard work really is done over on the B2C side. All right, we've added authorization, we've added authentication to our app. Next up, we're going to see how we can get rid of all the authentication connection strings from our app so we don't have to carry around that SQL connection string, or we don't have to carry around that storage connection string, and we can just have the applications themselves talk with, when they're up in Azure, talk to the services without having to have the connection strings in our next episode.